She took off her ring at dinner. I slid it onto her best friend's finger instead. That's how it happened. She thought she had me cornered, that by humiliating me in front of everyone she would look powerful. She smirked, took off her wedding ring, and whispered to her so-called new man that she was free. Everyone at the table saw it. Everyone heard her little performance. They thought I'd sit there, broken, defeated. But instead, I rose, reached across the table, and slid that very ring onto her best friend's hand. And when her friend smiled and accepted it, the whole room froze. My wife's smug grin crumbled into pure silence. If you want to hear exactly how it all went down, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment, because this story is one you won't forget. The night began like any other dinner party, only heavier with the kind of tension you can't quite describe but everyone can feel. We had been invited by friends to a long wooden table set beneath dim lights, wine glasses glistening and plates filled with steaming food. Candles flickered between bottles of champagne and polished cutlery, and the sound of laughter mixed with low music in the background. At first, I played the part, smiling where I needed to, nodding at stories I'd heard a dozen times before. But all the while, I felt her pulling away, not physically but emotionally, like she was already somewhere else. My wife, Megan, was always skilled at putting on a show, always needing an audience. Tonight, I could see her performance building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Across from me sat her best friend, Lauren, a woman I'd known almost as long as I'd known Megan. She had always been kind in a quiet way, never competing for attention the way Megan did. Lauren laughed at other people's jokes instead of making herself the center of every conversation. That night she sat near me, sipping her wine, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Her presence was oddly grounding, like an anchor in a room that was about to tip into chaos. I felt Megan's hand brush mine under the table, not affectionately but sharply, almost as if to remind me that she was in control. She leaned close to the man sitting beside her, a coworker she had insisted was just a friend, and whispered something in his ear. He chuckled, too loud, making sure people noticed. Megan's eyes flicked toward me, testing, taunting, waiting for me to react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I kept my face still, my hand steady on the stem of my glass. Inside, though, a fire was building. Then came the moment. Megan held her wine up, a sly smile playing on her lips, and said to the table, "Some things just aren't forever." She slid the wedding ring off her finger with slow, deliberate care, like she was peeling off an old layer of skin. She turned to her coworker, whispered, "Now I'm free," and laughed in that sharp, cutting way of hers. The table went quiet, forks paused midair, glasses frozen halfway to lips. I could feel the pity and the judgment in the silence, the way people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for me to crumble. But I didn't. I sat still, sipping my wine, letting the quiet stretch. Megan leaned back in her chair, triumphant, convinced she had broken me in front of her friends, her lover, and even her best friend. But Lauren's eyes were on me, curious, steady, waiting. And in that silence, I knew exactly what I had to do. That was the moment the night turned. I sat there with the weight of 100 stares pressing down on me, the clink of silverware fading into nothing. The ring lay on the table where Megan had left it, the gold band glinting in the candlelight like a spotlight on her betrayal. She leaned back smugly, her lips curled into the kind of smile that screamed triumph. She wanted the whole table to know she had won, that she had humiliated me so completely I would have no choice but to shrink into silence. But I didn't shrink. I didn't even flinch. I let the moment hang in the air until it became uncomfortable, until the guests shifted in their seats and cleared their throats, until Megan's smile twitched with the faintest thread of unease. I knew she was waiting for me to lash out, to beg, to create a scene she could later twist into her story of how cruel and insecure I was. But instead I reached out with steady hands and picked up the ring. Lauren was sitting next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence but far enough that she hadn't been drawn into Megan's little performance. She looked down at her plate, pretending not to notice the storm building at the table, though I could see her fingers tapping nervously against her wine glass. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch her eye. She looked at me, and in that look I saw something rare, understanding without words. She knew what had happened. She knew what Megan had done, and she knew I wasn't going to stay quiet. I closed my hand around the ring, the cool metal pressing into my palm, and for the first time all night Megan's eyes flicked toward me with a trace of uncertainty. I rose slowly from my chair. The scrape of wood against tile was louder than the music, louder than the whispers that immediately followed. All eyes turned to me. Megan straightened in her seat, a sharpness flashing across her face as she prepared for the outburst she thought was coming. The man she had been whispering to stiffened, his bravado evaporating in the sudden tension. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't give them the satisfaction of an angry spectacle. Instead, I turned to Lauren, and in one smooth motion, I slid the ring onto her finger. The gasp that tore through the room was almost theatrical. Glasses clinked as people leaned forward, conversations stopped mid-breath, and every single person at that table froze. Lauren's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock, but then she smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that spread across her face like she had been waiting for this moment all her life. She didn't pull her hand away. She didn't protest. She simply let the ring settle onto her finger and looked at me with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. Megan's chair screeched back as she stood, her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For once, the woman who always had a clever remark, always had the last word, was speechless. Her best friend, her confidant, her shadow at every dinner, every shopping trip, every whispered secret, was sitting there with her wedding ring on her finger, smiling like she belonged in that place more than Megan ever had. The man beside Megan shifted uncomfortably, his hand reaching out to steady her arm, but she jerked away, her eyes burning into me. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of 100 stares. But I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I kept my gaze fixed on Lauren, who sat straighter now, her hand resting gently on the table, the ring gleaming under the soft glow of the candles. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match could have been. People at the table looked between Megan and me, between Lauren and the ring, trying to process what they were seeing. Someone coughed nervously. Someone else whispered too loudly, "Did he really just?" And the sentence trailed off. Megan's hand shook as she reached for her glass, but she missed it, her fingers brushing it clumsily enough that the wine sloshed over the rim. Her composure was unraveling faster than she could gather it. I stayed standing, my hand resting lightly on the back of Lauren's chair, calm in the middle of the chaos. I could feel Megan's fury like heat against my skin, but I refused to meet her eyes. I wanted her to feel invisible, to feel what it was like to be the one cast aside, the one left out of the story. Lauren, sensing the shift, leaned back slightly and tilted her head, a faint laugh escaping her lips. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking. It was simply the laugh of someone who had seen the truth revealed in the most unexpected way. Megan finally slammed her hands against the table, the sound jolting the room, and snapped, "You can't be serious!" Her voice cracked, and the confidence she had flaunted only moments ago dissolved into desperation. But it was too late. The show was over, and she had been outperformed in front of her own audience. The rest of the table sat in stunned silence, unsure of whether to move, whether to speak, whether to even breathe too loudly. And in that stillness, I realized the power of what I had done. I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to argue. I hadn't even needed to accuse her of anything. All I had needed to do was take the symbol she discarded so casually and give it to someone who understood its weight. The dinner continued in fragments after that, awkward conversations sprouting up like weeds trying to cover broken ground. Megan stayed rigid in her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling, her ring finger bare for everyone to see. Lauren, on the other hand, seemed lighter, freer, her eyes glinting every time she caught mine. The room would never forget what had happened, and Megan knew it. Every guest at that table had witnessed her attempt to humiliate me, and my refusal to let her write the ending. And as I sat back down, the ring glinting on Lauren's finger like a beacon in the candlelight, I knew the night had only just begun. The air in the dining room had grown so heavy you could almost slice it with the butter knives still lying untouched beside the plates. Megan sat stiffly in her chair, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her cheeks a strange mix of flushed red and pale white. The wine glass in front of her remained half full, but her hand trembled so violently she didn't dare reach for it again. Across from her, Lauren turned the ring slowly on her finger, as if testing how it felt, her face calm but her smile sharp enough to cut. The other guests had given up on pretending to carry on small talk. The whole table had become a silent battlefield, and every eye flicked between us like they were watching a play unravel in real time. I could sense the whispers beginning to swell, cautious at first, but growing louder with every awkward pause. People weren't just shocked, they were fascinated. They wanted to see what would happen next. Megan had always lived for control. She thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, the one who dictated where the conversation went, the one who knew how to draw all eyes to herself. But now her voice had deserted her. Her performance derailed in front of the very people she'd hoped to impress. She opened her mouth more than once, then shut it again, her words catching like sandpaper in her throat. It was the first time in years I'd seen her lost for words, and that silence was sweeter than any outburst could have been. Lauren leaned slightly toward me, close enough for only me to hear, and whispered, "Are you sure?" Her voice wasn't fearful. It was curious, almost playful, but there was still a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I gave the smallest nod, and she seemed to understand everything in that single gesture. She straightened her shoulders and rested her hand, ring gleaming, on the edge of the table where everyone could see it. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't going to hide. The man Megan had been whispering to earlier, her so-called lover, was clearly squirming under the weight of the room's attention. His jaw tightened, and he shifted in his seat, as though hoping he could somehow melt into the chair and disappear. He wouldn't meet my eyes, nor would he look at Megan. It was as if he had suddenly realized the spotlight could turn on him just as quickly, and his silence was an admission in itself. People noticed. They always notice when someone refuses to defend the person next to them. Finally, Megan snapped. Her voice cut through the room like glass breaking. "This is a joke," she spat, her eyes darting wildly between me and Lauren. "Take it off, Lauren. Give it back." She reached across the table as if she could snatch the ring from her friend's hand, but Lauren didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled her hand back, fingers curling protectively, and said softly but firmly, "No." That single word landed heavier than a shout, heavier than any speech could have. The room gasped again, the tension crackling like static. Megan froze, her hand hovering in the air, then recoiled as though burned. Her face twisted with betrayal. Not at me, not even at the man beside her, but at Lauren. For years, she had counted on her best friend's loyalty, on her unwavering support, and in one moment that loyalty had shifted. It was the kind of betrayal Megan could never have imagined, the kind she had never prepared herself for. And I had given it to her without ever raising my voice. The dinner staff tried to continue their service, moving quietly between tables, but their eyes betrayed their curiosity. They stole glances as they placed plates down, their movements awkward as if they were intruding on something they would later tell their coworkers about in hushed tones. The music playing faintly in the background no longer provided comfort. It sounded like a mockery, cheerful notes clashing against the chaos unraveling at the table. I leaned back in my chair, calm and steady, watching Megan unravel in slow motion. She tried again to speak, but her voice cracked. "You think this makes you look strong?" she hissed, though the words wavered. "You think people will respect you for this?" But no one rushed to her side. No one agreed with her. No one even nodded. The silence of the room was louder than her accusation, and she felt it. I could see it in the way her lips trembled, in the way her eyes darted from one guest to another, searching desperately for someone to validate her, someone to back her up. But all she found were blank faces, some pitying, some disgusted, none supportive. Lauren exhaled slowly and placed her napkin neatly on the table, her movements graceful and deliberate. Then she looked at Megan with an expression I'll never forget, a mix of sorrow and strength, like she had finally stepped out from under her shadow. "You threw it away," she said quietly, almost too softly for the table to hear, but the words cut through the noise all the same. "He just gave it to someone who won't." That line broke Megan. Her hand went to her bare finger instinctively, clutching at the empty space where the ring had been, as if she could will it back into existence. But it was gone. And no matter what she said, no matter how loudly she tried to reclaim control, everyone in that room had already seen the truth. They had seen her discard what she thought was worthless, and they had seen me prove it wasn't. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room had turned. Megan, once the center of attention, was now the outsider, her carefully built image collapsing in front of her closest friends. The guests whispered among themselves, glancing at me with a mix of awe and curiosity. No one looked at her with admiration anymore. No one looked at her lover with respect. The balance had shifted completely, and Megan knew it. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes glassy and vacant. It was the first time I'd ever seen her look small, truly small, like the mask she had worn for so long had finally cracked. And I didn't have to say a single word to make it happen. As the evening dragged on, the table tried to stitch itself back together with forced laughter and stilted conversation, but the wound remained open. Megan barely touched her food, her appetite gone, her pride shattered. Lauren, meanwhile, carried herself with newfound confidence, her hand resting casually on the table, the ring catching every glint of light. The guests pretended not to stare, but their eyes always found their way back to that golden band and the story it now told. And me, I sat in silence, calm, collected, watching Megan crumble. For once, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of her betrayal. She was the one being judged, the one being whispered about. The roles had reversed and the power was mine. The final act of that dinner was not marked by shouting or by plates breaking across the table, but by the unbearable silence of a woman who realized she had lost everything she thought she controlled. Megan's voice, usually sharp and commanding, had dwindled to a fragile whisper, so faint that even those sitting closest to her strained to catch the words. But it didn't matter anymore, because the truth had already been revealed, and there was no taking it back. Lauren sat with her hand placed deliberately on the table, the ring gleaming proudly on her finger, and every glance that drifted her way confirmed that the room no longer belonged to Megan. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension wash over me, feeling the weight that had crushed me for years finally lifting piece by piece. Megan had made herself the villain of her own story, and all I had done was let her speak louder than she realized. By the time dessert was brought out, the atmosphere was brittle, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Some guests tried to steer the evening towards safer waters, clinking their spoons against porcelain cups and forcing laughter that fell flat in the heavy air. But the damage was too severe. Every attempt at normalcy collapsed beneath the collective awareness of what had just transpired. Megan sat rigidly, her eyes darting between faces that no longer gave her the reassurance she craved. Even her so-called lover avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, pretending to scroll through his phone, as if hiding behind a glowing screen could shield him from the wreckage. I took my time, savoring the small bites of cake set in front of me, not because I was hungry but because it emphasized my calm. Each forkful was deliberate, each sip of coffee measured, and the contrast to Megan's frantic, shallow breaths was undeniable. I didn't need to raise my voice. My composure said everything. I had taken her theatrics, her need to humiliate me in front of others, and turned it back on her with nothing more than a gesture and a silence that grew louder with every passing second. At one point, Megan tried again to reclaim control. She forced a laugh, brittle and hollow, and said something about how silly it all was, how people were making too much of nothing. But the words rang false, and the room knew it. No one joined in her laughter, and the sound died quickly, leaving her more exposed than before. She gripped her wineglass so tightly I half expected it to crack under the pressure. But even if it had, it wouldn't have drowned out the whispers that had already cemented her fall. Lauren's strength surprised me. For years she had stood in Megan's shadow, nodding along, playing the part of the loyal friend. But now she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded more respect than Megan ever had. She didn't gloat, didn't throw accusations or insults across the table. Instead, she sat poised, her calm presence speaking louder than any outburst could. When someone asked if she was all right, she simply smiled and said, "I'm fine," her voice steady and clear. That steadiness cut deeper into Megan than any cruelty could have. It showed that Lauren had found her own ground, a ground that Megan could no longer shake. Eventually, the dinner began to wind down. Guests excused themselves with polite murmurs, but none left without casting one last look at Megan. Their eyes filled with pity, confusion, or judgment. No one offered her comfort. No one offered her defense. She sat abandoned in the very room she thought she commanded, her pride stripped bare. As people gathered their coats and purses, they avoided her, choosing instead to nod at me, to whisper to Lauren, to acknowledge the new order that had quietly emerged. When I finally stood, I didn't rush. I rose slowly, sliding my chair back with a controlled ease, and placed my napkin on the table with deliberate care. The sound was soft, but in that moment, it was louder than Megan's earlier protestations. Lauren stood beside me, her movements graceful, her hand finding mine without hesitation. We didn't have to announce our departure. The sight of us together, calm and composed, said everything. Megan looked up at me then, her eyes wide and wet, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a final glance. I didn't need to. She knew. She knew that she had orchestrated her own downfall, and that I had simply chosen the moment to let her unravel in front of everyone she wanted to impress. Her lips parted, as though she wanted to beg, to plead, to lash out. But no words came. She sat mute, powerless, her hand still clutching at the bare finger where her ring once had been. We walked out together, Lauren's hand still resting firmly in mine, the ring glittering under the soft glow of the restaurant lights. The chatter from inside followed us out the door, but it didn't weigh on me. It wasn't my burden anymore. I had carried Megan's betrayal for too long, let it gnaw at me in silence. Tonight, I had laid it down, and in doing so, I had left her to carry the weight herself. The cool night air felt like freedom as we stepped outside, and for the first time in years, I felt taller, lighter, untethered. I didn't need revenge through rage. I didn't need to shout or break anything. I had shown her and everyone else that silence, when wielded with precision, could be the sharpest weapon of all. Megan had always underestimated me, always assumed my quiet meant weakness. But tonight she had learned what quiet could do. And in that moment, as the door closed behind us and the murmur of whispers faded, I realized something vital. I didn't need to prove myself to her anymore. I had nothing to prove to anyone. I had already won. And that was the night she finally understood the truth. Silence can be louder than any scream, and a single gesture can destroy everything built on lies. If you've listened this far, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in my place, and stay tuned for the next story. You won't want to miss it.